The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented.
Hello and welcome to Health for a Lifetime. Today, joining us in the studio is Dr. Clarence Ng from Weimar Institute in California. I'm Don McIntosh, and today we're going to be talking about a very interesting and important subject. That is foodborne illnesses, and really, what's another way of saying that, Dr. Ng?
Well, foodborne diseases or diseases that may be caused by you eating different types of food. Particularly today, we're going to be talking about diseases that are increased or you increase your risk of if you eat what we call animal foods, like meat, fish, chicken, anything which comes from an animal. And that may even include eggs and dairy products. There are risks involved.
For those of you who are maybe not familiar with Weimar Institute, it is an institute in California which I think just recently was the responsible committee on medicine gave you a high rating for your weight loss program.
Right. The Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine said that we are the #2 weight loss program in the United States. It's exciting to know that we can help people lose weight and that other people are recognizing this. And for this, we're very grateful. But it's really neat to see how when people come in, they change their lifestyle, and we tell them, you're not going on a diet, because people say, if I go on a diet, I can get off the diet. But I said, we're making changes for a lifetime.
Well, speaking of changes for a lifetime, what are some things that we should be concerned about in terms of the things we eat? You mentioned cows, chickens, and fish.
Well, as we look at cows, it's been interesting to note that in the last few years, we found significantly more problems than we realized before with cows. Something that's been in the news for the last couple years is mad cow disease, or if you want the medical term, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Now, this is a very interesting disease which is now recognized, and we see this, and we're beginning to see the problems in human beings. And this first became apparent in England, and this was discovered in 1996. Initially, they found the disease in animals, mad cow disease in animals in 1986. It was discovered in animals. And at that time, they thought that if it affects the cows, that's fine. Well, it really isn't fine, but at least it doesn't involve human beings. In other words, humans could eat the cows, and there was no concern that humans would become sick with this type of problem. So in 1996, so things have changed. At that time, they said, there may be a link between mad cow disease and what we're finding now in humans. It's called a new variant of something called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the disease which has been around for quite a time. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is one of a family of diseases called the transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. It's similar to that. Now, these diseases are also found in other animals. We find that in animals, they affect not only cattle, they have had a similar disease in sheep. It's called scrapie. They found this disease in mink, which have eaten, say, sheep that have died from scrapie. And it's also been found in other animals that have eaten something we call animal byproduct.
I noticed in your note here that you said it's also in cats.
Right.
Should we have cats in our homes?
Well, there again, it's the cats who've eaten the animal byproduct. If you go by the supermarket or wherever you buy your pet food and read the label on your pet foods, it was interesting. We did this the other day, and a significant number of the pet foods have something called animal byproduct. Well, where does animal byproduct come from? Animal byproduct comes from what we call the rendering plants. And rendering plants are the plants that take the remains of the cattle, roadkill, other animals that have been put to sleep, because no one wants to claim them from the pounds. And all of these are then sent to the rendering plant, and they're processed, and they become a protein meal, which is then
put in the food?
It's sold to the pet food producers. It's sold to other people who want to enrich the food of their animals.
So would it be safe to say then, if you're going to have an animal that doesn't eat other animals for lunch,
right,
and then protect yourself from that?
That's
Tell
right.
me a little bit about how this BSE, this mad cow disease, actually works. What does it do to the body? Is it fatal? What happens if you contract that disease?
Okay, well, let's go back to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Normally, we find this in about 1 person in 1 million people in an average population. And this usually affects only older people. But what has happened in the United Kingdom, they have found that younger people were getting a disease which is similar to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and so they call it a new variant or the new form of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and they have related this then to the mad cow disease. The thing is, what produces the infection, or the particle that produces the infection, is called a prion. And prions are interesting. They're a protein particle. It's not like a virus. It's not like a bacteria. But what makes us fearful of this is, if you would normally use the temperature at which you could sterilize something, like 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius, the particle is still infectious. In fact, they've raised the temperature up to 680 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
And this is where things would normally become ash, and it was still possible to cause an infection. You can treat it with formalin, you can treat it with alcohol, gamma radiation, and it can still produce an infection.
So any of these things they've been talking about recently in the news, like increasing radiation of meat or different things before it goes on the market, are not going to touch a prion. In other words, it's going to be passed regardless of what you're doing.
Right, it's going to go through, and it still has the potential for causing an infection if it has, if it is infective with the BSE.
So is there any place that, for someone who wants to eat beef, should people be eating it then?
Well, I think that if you really want to be safe and don't want to have any risk for those types of problems or diseases, I think you're really best to avoid beef. Actually, any fish and chicken as well, because, if you want what's really best, your best diet, of course, comes back to a plant-based diet.
Let me ask another question that I don't know whether or not we've touched on. What exactly does this kuru, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, mad cow disease, the human variant, what does it actually do? If you contract that, what happens to you?
Well, one thing we know is it's universally fatal. There is no known cure. And what happens initially, some of the earlier symptoms are, first you have memory loss, then there's confusion, strange behavior, and there's difficulty in walking. Finally, the person is unable to care for themselves, and eventually they die. So, it's not a disease
to toy with.
Yeah, it's not a disease that you want, because if you get the disease, if it's diagnosed and confirmed, we don't have any cure. There's no known treatment.
Let me ask another question. I know there's been a lot of talk recently about antibiotics and how they're used with cattle. Do you have any concerns about that?
Yes. The reason they use antibiotics in food production in animals is the animals grow faster, and of course they get a better survival rate. Some of the problems with using antibiotics in animal husbandry or raising of animals is that we're finding that the bacteria that are there then become resistant to the antibiotic. So this is leading to more resistant bacteria, which means that if someone should eat the animal and get sick with some type of food poisoning with a bacteria that is resistant to the antibiotics, when they go to their health care provider and they get the medicine that would normally cure them of the problem, the bacteria says, "Oh, my favorite antibiotic. I'm so glad this was given." In other words, but the antibiotic doesn't have any effect against the bacteria, and the person still remains sick, and unfortunately, sometimes they may die.
So are we falling behind in terms of the new antibiotics that are being created to fight these diseases? Are we more susceptible now than, say, 10 years ago?
Yes, we are, because what we're finding now is that because of the development of more resistant bacteria, the scientists are concerned that we won't be able to develop enough antibiotics to take care of the bacteria that we have because of increasing resistance and the indiscriminate use of antibiotics by people. What we find now is that we may end up back as we were in the 20s and 30s before the era of antibiotics, where most of the antibiotics that we have will, all of the bacteria that we're trying to treat will be resistant to them, and the antibiotics will have no effect. So essentially, we're like in the pre-antibiotic era.
I've talked with some healthcare providers and whatnot that have said that even now there are strains of disease that no antibiotic can really touch. It keeps it at bay, but it doesn't really eradicate it.
Well, this is true, and one of the most potent antibiotics we now have available is something called vancomycin, and this has been useful against resistant staph. But we're finding now that there are some strains of staph that are resistant to the vancomycin, and even when they're using combinations of vancomycin with other antibiotics, they aren't able to destroy the bacteria. And this is a serious problem which we're now facing in the medical world.
So if someone doesn't eat foods that have been given antibiotics, in other words, specifically meat products, animals, then they're going to be more responsive to an antibiotic should they ever get sick, is what you're saying.
Well, yes and no. The advantage of not eating the meat is sometimes there may be antibiotic residues that are in the meat, and then when you eat the meat, then you may, if you're sensitive, you may have a allergic reaction if you then take the antibiotic or given the antibiotic for another reason. But the main problem with antibiotics used in animal husbandry is increasing resistant bacteria.
Before we go to our break, I want to talk a little bit about fish. You have a concern about that.
Yes, fish, because of their wide range and because they take in what's in the environment. If their environment is polluted with heavy metals or industrial waste, then we have the problem with toxicity there, especially if it's like lead, mercury, PCBs, and other things which are used in industry, and sometimes industrial effluent or waste is discharged into the rivers, the streams, and the water, and in the oceans. And so even though you may get fish that swim way out in the middle of the ocean, tuna, salmon, and other things, depending on where they travel and what's in the water, there may still be pollution or toxins in these fish that we really don't want to expose ourselves to.
So in reading your notes, you say that there's 1 million more possibility, I don't know how to say that exactly.
Bioconcentration.
Bioconcentration. What you mean by that is what you're meaning that the fish, somehow the water comes into them and they take out all the things that may harm us and they just concentrate them in their own little bodies.
Well, part of that, yes, because some of it ends up in the plant life. The smaller fish eat the plants or the phytoplankton. Then the larger fish eat the smaller fish, and the larger ones, in other words, the higher up the food chain, the larger the fish, then the more effect he has for concentrating this. So you may start with something which is only 200ths part per million in the water, but then by the time it gets into the animal, it may be increased up to 1 million times, or into the fish. So this is our concern.
Can this cause cancer?
Well, if it's the right chemicals, yes. If they're carcinogens like PCBs, very definitely. It increases the risk for cancer.
We are talking with Dr. Clarence Ng from Weimar Institute in California. We've been talking about meat. We've been talking about mad cow disease. When we come back, we're going to talk about chicken. We're going to talk about milk. We're going to talk about things that could very well save your life, and we hope that you join us.
Have you found yourself wishing that you could shed a few pounds? Have you been on a diet for most of your life, but not found anything that will really keep the weight off? If you've answered yes to any of these questions, then we have a solution for you that works. Dr. Hans Deal and Dr. Eileen Ludington have written a marvelous booklet called Reversing Obesity Naturally, and we'd like to send it to you free of charge. Here's a medically sound approach successfully used by thousands who were able to eat more and lose weight permanently without feeling guilty or hungry through lifestyle medicine. Dr. Deal and Dr. Ludington have been featured on 3ABM, and in this booklet, they present a sensible approach to eating, nutrition, and lifestyle changes that can help you prevent heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer. Call or write today for your free copy of Reversing Obesity Naturally, and you could be on your way to a healthier, happier you. It's absolutely free of charge, so call or write today.
Welcome back. We have been talking with Dr. Clarence Ng from Weimar Institute in California about food-borne illnesses. And as we were talking, Dr. Ng, we had mentioned some things that really should concern us if we're eating, cows, chicken, fish. And you had mentioned mad cow disease. Have there been any documented cases of that in America?
Well, there's a suspected first case, and this is reported in UPI in May of last year. A family in New York, their daughter became sick, and as they explored the history on this, they found that this family had received a gift of beef from Great Britain in 1987, and they ate this. And there may be a relationship between this and the disease that the daughter has, because the disease that she had is very similar to the variant of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is associated with mad cow disease. So there may be.
So she succumbed to that disease? Or
yes,
okay.
She did.
Another thing we were talking about was fish. And I don't know if we're out of the water yet with that. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us before we go on?
Well, they found that there are elevated levels of pesticides in people who have, in ladies who have breast cancer. And this is similar to some of the pesticides that are found in fish. So there may be a relationship here, which shows again that our waters are polluted. And if you're going to eat fish, you need to make sure where they come from. And because of the wide circulation of things when they get in the water, is fish really safe? I really think that the best way, of course, is not to eat any fish.
What do you have left for us to eat then, Doctor? We don't have any beef, we don't have any fish. What can we eat?
Oh, there's wonderful fruits and vegetables and cereal grains, things like this. And I really think that those of us, or people who are not used to eating these types of foods, need to expand their dietary horizons, because it's interesting in what people eat. If you take a food history on people, you find that the people usually eat certain foods, maybe 15, a maximum 20 different foods. And they go through this list and they just continue to go over and over this. And those are the foods they basically eat, and they vary very little from that. So what we want to do is expand your food horizons, get you to try foods that you've never tried before. And these are some interesting and exciting things that you're really missing out on, especially when you learn how to prepare them well.
I know we want to talk about E. coli and how it affects, some meat sources and whatnot, but before we go to that, and I want to go to that next, just a question in passing. We've talked about pesticides in fish. We've talked about how they are magnified within their little bodies, and then we eat them. Aren't there pesticides with animal or rather plant products as well?
Yes, there are pesticides that are used with plant products as well. And if the pesticides are used properly, the way they're supposed to, the amount of pesticides which you find in plants is usually much lower than what you're going to find in meat. In other words, the numbers that we use, if you eat meat, meat will have about 14.5 times the amount of pesticides that you would find in plants. Dairy products, approximately 5.5 times. And this is, again, because of what we call bioconcentration. It takes so many pounds of plants to produce so many pounds of meat. And the ratio varies from the animal, anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds of plants to, or grains to produce a pound of chicken or a pound of meat. So there's this factor of bioconcentration. Dairy products likewise, because of what the cow eats, if there are chemicals and pesticides there are going to be some found in the milk as well.
Let's talk about hamburger.
Well, hamburgers, that used to be one of my favorite foods. But now that I've found out what hamburgers are made from, it's on the list that I leave out. But interestingly enough, you've heard of something they call hamburger disease. And hamburger disease is associated with one type of bacteria called E. coli, and it's a certain type in this. It's E. coli O157H7. And if you eat hamburger that has been contaminated with this bacteria, you can get very sick. It causes something called hemolytic uremic syndrome, and what happens is the red blood cells inside the person begin to hemolyze or disintegrate. And when they disintegrate, this blocks the kidneys, it causes symptoms of stroke, causes other problems, and especially if this happens in small children. And children have died from this disease. Now, this disease can be prevented if the meat is cooked well done. Then this will kill the bacteria. But unfortunately, some people don't like their hamburgers or their meat cooked well done.
So when you say hamburgers or meat, does this mean this you can find this in some other place other than just hamburger?
Yes, it has been found in other things than hamburger. They found it in apple juice, unpasteurized apple juice. And what happened was they found that the apples that were used to make this apple juice had fallen and cattle grazed nearby. So if the apple juice is not pasteurized or sterilized, and pasteurization is not sterilization, but at least with pasteurization you're heating it up to a certain temperature, so you're going to kill the bacteria or most of the bacteria, it's safer. Definitely don't drink unpasteurized apple juice because you are at risk depending on where the apple juice comes from. And this is how it happened in the apple juice.
Parents today have to be quite vigilant, don't they?
This is true. This is very true. If you're aware of things and you know what to look for and what to watch for, you can save your family a lot of problems. Another thing about E. coli O157H7, I think it was a couple years ago, they had the largest meat recall they've ever had. 25 million pounds of ground beef was recalled because of contamination with this bacteria.
Yeah, I remember that. That's one of the reasons I think they're in the government now talking about irradiation of all meat to try and avoid that problem or whatnot. Do you think that'll work, this irradiation idea?
Well, if it kills the bacteria, which I think it probably will certainly make it safer so that you shouldn't have this problem. But there again, why expose yourself to the risk? You know, you say, well, if I cook the meat well done, I don't have the problem. But as we talked about in a previous program, we find that when you cook the meat well done, you also produce some carcinogens, which, again, you're better off to avoid. So I still think the best way is to not use the meat.
Let me ask another question. Of course, we are talking about beef and some other things, but beef primarily we've talked about. Well, what about the other substances created by cows for ingestion, for instance, milk? Do you have concerns with that? These are not heated up that I know of to any real high temperature before we ingest them. Can we be getting mad cow disease or other things from milk?
Well, there's no known proof at the present time that mad cow disease can be transmitted through milk. But that's something that we don't know, and we'll just have to wait and see what the future shows. But we do know that a significant number of cattle in the U.S. are infected with something called bovine leukemia virus. And that when this raw milk is fed to other animals like chimpanzees, it produces tumors. Now, it's true that if you sterilize your milk, heating it to ultra-high temperature, that you destroy any virus which can cause this. But the pasteurization process does not heat milk high enough to sterilize it. So some viruses may get through. If you want to drink milk, I would say the safest milk for you to use would be that which is sterilized at ultra-high temperature. These are the kinds you find the cartons in the stores that do not have to be refrigerated until after they are open. But I really think the safest and the best way is not to use dairy products.
Is that an increasing position of the medical community?
It's more and more people are becoming aware of this, and those who are becoming aware of this are cautioning their people, you know, their patients, those they refer to, that you really don't need milk once you're beyond the age of weaning. There is no necessity for milk as a food. We can get all the food elements we need that are calcium, which is one of the primary reasons milk is promoted for adults, in your plant foods.
So we don't need that milk mustache?
No, we do not need the milk mustache. That is absolutely true.
I want to talk a little bit about chicken with you. You have some interesting things about that, and I think our viewers would be interested in that. But before we go there, are there any other problems you want to mention about meat generally?
No, I think probably at the present time we've covered the main things with meat. You need to be careful when you cook it because cooking itself produces carcinogens. You need to be aware of the pesticide residues and other things found in meat and your increased risk for diabetes, cancer, high blood pressure, and heart disease. But talking about chickens, Consumers Reports had a very interesting study which was reported last year in which they sampled almost 1,000 chickens from various markets throughout the U.S. And they found a significantly high percentage that were contaminated with both Salmonella and Campylobacter. In fact, I think the figure was 71% were contaminated with one or the other, which means only 29% did not have either. And the other thing was that almost all the chickens were contaminated with E. coli, which is a sign of fecal contamination. So the processing of chickens is not a very sanitary process, and you need to be aware of this. When you eat chicken, you need to handle the meat as if it is contaminated, which it is.
I think many of us have heard about Salmonella and that scare a few years ago that was really public. What is this Campylobacter? What does it do?
Well, Campylobacter is another disease that causes food poisoning. It's commonly found in chicken. It causes diarrhea. It causes severe illness. And it causes anywhere from 110 to up to possibly 1,000 deaths per year in the United States. In fact, they estimate that deaths from foodborne diseases in the United States amounts to almost around 27 people a day, which comes to around 9,000 people each year.
Wow.
And these can be avoided by avoiding animal foods.
What about eggs?
Eggs, again, I think if you want to use eggs, they need to be well cooked, but even eggs that are not cracked can be contaminated with Salmonella. And again, eggs, because of the hazard with cholesterol in the yolk, I think you're better off without them.
We've been talking with Dr. Clarence Ng from Weimar Institute in California. He's reviewed the literature on reasons why we should really think twice about eating any animal products. Let me read in closing what Dr. Richard Lacey, a mad cow researcher from the United Kingdom, says. There is now overwhelming scientific evidence and medical cause for avoiding the consumption of meat despite the government's attempts to persuade us otherwise. We hope this has been useful to you, and we hope that you have health for a lifetime.